This is Sam Long.
I'm Ron Peters.
And I'm John Nugent.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
after class.
Thanks for joining us on our latest episode. It's a beautiful day. The sun is cleared. It's like almost heavenly. But we'll get back to that in a second.
Oh, nice. Well played, Sam.
I do what I can. We also want to remind you that next week, we've been teasing this about our special guest, but we now reveal that it's going to be the one and only Kate Blakely.
Yay, Kate.
Kate teaches cross-cultural ministry as well as restoration history here at the school, and so she's the perfect person to come on as our first guest as we as we talk about the nature of the Restoration movement and leading up to Restoration Week here at the school, and of course Restoration Sunday, which we've mentioned in the past. So, tune in next week and hear what Kate has to say about all of that, as well as our experiences with the Restoration movement. But as I said, it is indeed a heavenly day, which brings us back to our topic for the day. We're going to continue talking about what does the Bible actually say about heaven in conjunction with John's book, Endangered Gospel. So John's going to discuss just what a few views might be.
Yeah, last week we tried to figure out what the Old Testament said about the afterlife. And so we explored all the uses of the term heaven, and it means the place where God lives, the sky where the birds fly, outer space where the stars and other things are. But in the Old Testament, heaven is not really described as a place that humans go to in the afterlife to enjoy a blissful state in God's presence.
Yeah, no indication whatsoever.
Yeah. The traditional view for the majority of the Old Testament is you died and you went to Sheol for a lifeless-like existence in the grave. And only in the book of Daniel do we have a clear expectation that some people might arise from life, from the grave, some to everlasting life and others to everlasting punishment of some sort, right? Mm-hmm. What is it, contempt or?
Yes, shame, contempt, all that.
Yeah. So now we're about to approach the New Testament. And like in our study of Satan, a lot has happened between the Old Testament's teaching on our subject and the New Testament's teaching on our subject. And we're not going to dedicate 2 episodes to unpacking it all. We're just going to cut to the chase and say that there are 4 different options, 4 different ways of conceiving some sort of afterlife. And a 5th option might be the people who didn't believe in any afterlife, like the Sadducees. I set someone up for the joke.
Because they were sad, you see? Is that the joke you're looking for?
Yeah, because they didn't believe in the afterlife.
So they were sad, you see.
But we're going to talk about 4 different positions. It took you way long to come in with that, and Sam, frankly, I thought it was going to come from you.
I just don't think it's funny, so I didn't say it.
Neither did I.
Oh, all right. I mean, what's more funny is that they apparently didn't pay attention to the post-Old Testament. That's why they didn't believe in the afterlife. That's more funny, I think. All right, keep
How
going.
many times can we
Every episode we talk about the intertestamental literature, it will come up.
Yes.
We could also...
The tradition is growing.
Yeah.
And by the way, it's coming up in class, I will let you know. So post-Old Testament is now working its way into my classrooms. Thank you, guys. Love you so much.
To be clear, students are mocking you with it?
Yes.
It brings joy.
It does. I mean, even the manatees are making fun of him. Oh, wait.
Yeah.
Speaking of manatees, let's go back to your book.
Speaking of manatees, I was thinking about how we want to get the gospel off the endangered list, just like the manatees. No longer an endangered gospel. We want it to be, healthy and in a good ecosystem. So get the gospel off the endangered list, just like the manatees.
Which, by the way, are also known as sea cows. And so if they're going to make a noise, it's not going to be like a dolphin. It's probably more like a moo, like a groaning sea cow. That's better. Anyway,
I've
sorry.
got so many more jokes, and now you're just stopping me.
There are 4 views of people who believe in an afterlife. There are 4 different ways people talk about this. Some of these grow out of the intertestamental literature. Some of them have cropped up since then among theologians, and we're going to use, we have a brief description of each one, and we want to just put those out there and then talk about which of these views best lines up with the majority of verses we find in the New Testament. So one view is the view that we call the cartoon view. We introduced this last week. It's the cartoon view where some Wile E. Coyote gets an anvil dropped on his head because the Roadrunner did something, and he becomes a spirit with a halo that floats up into the sky. Right? And this is the view where when you die, the body remains in the grave, but your soul or spirit or something ascends into heaven to be with God forever. So that's the cartoon view. The one most depicted in cartoons and many TV shows that are not cartoons.
Yeah,
and it's held by a lot of people. So we call it cartoon because it's a convenient shorthand, not to make fun of it in any sort of way. Well, I'm getting looks that maybe we do a little bit.
Ron and Sam are...
View number 2. We're going to call that the reunion view. In this view, the body, after you die, remains in the grave, but the soul or spirit goes to heaven to be with Jesus, and then, at the end of time, at the consummation when the kingdom comes, the soul later returns to the earth with Jesus, and then the body is raised from the grave and reunites with the soul that came down from heaven to inhabit new life on the new earth. So it's a reunion of the dead body with of course, the dead body is renewed. Right. It's a resurrection body,
not a zombie or something.
Not the same exact, but it's a new spiritual body. Reunites with the spirit, which has been spending time in sabbatical in heaven.
Yeah, I would say that's the view that I encountered the most in my formative years in the church. This idea of a reunion of the spirit and the body coming out of the grave. That heaven is like an intermediary state. And so you just kind of hang out there until the resurrection takes place.
Okay.
So I thought of another name for it. I just thought of it. It's not going to take, but the church camp view. You go away, you spend time with Jesus, you come back home, you're all jazzed up for Jesus.
The church camp view, that's great.
If only we came up with that before.
I'm sorry.
We're going to have to go with reunion.
Or church camp.
The third view is what we're calling the Daniel view, building off of what we talked about in the book of Daniel last week, that when you die, your whole self goes to the grave. And Daniel uses language of sleep, go to your resting place, to awake at the end of time or at the time when the kingdom comes in its fullness, in which time all that went into the grave arises to have a new bodied life in the kingdom in its fullness. Mm-hmm. So this is the Daniel view.
Also known as soul sleep view, which John hates. This idea that the soul is taking a nap until Jesus comes back, and then kaboom, it's awake.
Could be also the OR view. You get put under, and you have no perception of any passing of time until you wake up again. So the OR view, the operating room view.
Operating room view. Thank you. I did not follow that.
OR, operating room.
Obtuse rectangles? Wait, that's not a thing.
Yeah.
Wow. I don't know. I could be sleepy today.
So the Daniel view, you just go down to the grave until you wake up.
Soul sleep.
And why I don't like soul sleep is because it presupposes this thing called a soul that is separate from the body.
Oh, okay.
There's a dualism built into that where part of it is doing something and another part's doing another thing. I just don't think Daniel goes into that kind of detail, even though Martin Luther, the great reformer, embraced the term soul sleep, put it on the map, and a lot of people,
that's where that
like Sam, are comfortable with the language.
Hey, I'm as Greek as they come.
The fourth view, we couldn't cram into one word, despite our best efforts, is the split grave view. And that is that the body remains in the grave, like 6 feet under, in a coffin, but the soul is stored in a place that's also part of the grave, which could be called Hades or Sheol or Paradise, which is itself part of the grave, location unknown, but it's not up in heaven somewhere. It's kind of in the depths of the earth, and the body and soul are raised together and transformed at the second coming into a new body to inhabit the new earth. Mm-hmm. So these are the four views: the cartoon one, the reunion one, the Daniel one, and the split grave. And we're going to use these to kind of go through the New Testament material and say, hey, what do we find support for What do we not find support for? What are some of the legitimate options we have as Christians who are trying to have a view that is in continuity with both the Old and the New Testament?
And just to reiterate, where do these views come from? Where do we see these that sort of come out so that we can apply them to the New Testament texts, mostly in intertestamental stuff?
Some of them, obviously the Daniel one from Daniel.
Sure.
The spiritual ascent view you see most as a variant of the Greek, how Platonic Greek thought, especially Middle Platonism, a view of Greek that was prominent, especially in Egypt around the time of the century before and during Jesus. So we could call that the Greek view, although I think some people would be offended by that.
Probably.
So they like cartoon better. The reunion view, I think I heard that more from scholars today and from teachers.
Yeah, more modern view. It's like kind of arose into more modern theological reflections.
Trying to make sense of the biblical text, perhaps, or some biblical texts.
Yeah, there's a passage from Paul. It's kind of bringing a couple of passages together to form a view that synthesizes them.
Okay.
Which is one of the challenges. But in all my readings of the Second Temple Jewish literature, intertestament literature, I don't see one that quite matches that. So that's kind of a new one that people create from the New Testament, not one that was up and running at the time of Jesus, as far as I can tell. And the notion of a split grave or part of the body going into different places, there's some precedent for that in the intertestament literature.
Okay.
I think in Enoch, you see stuff like that.
Okay.
So why don't you start us with the New Testament material, Ron? You're the New Testament guy.
Oh, great. I'm the one on the spot here. So, I think that you definitely begin to see a lot more explicit statements about what people are going to experience after they die, that there is a confidence that there is some sort of existence beyond that. Now, the exact nature of it is what we're going to debate here today, but at least in the New Testament, there's an expectation, I think at the very least, of a conscious existence after you die, post-mortem existence. There are a lot of passages in the New Testament. So one of the first ones that I thought of, and as I was making my list, would be Jesus' own words at the cross when he's speaking to the criminal. The two, depending on which gospel account you read, some of the gospels say both the criminals are mocking him. But in Luke's gospel, one of the criminals is mocking Jesus, and the other one rebukes him and says, basically, we deserve this, he doesn't. And so you should just shut up and die on your cross and stop mocking Jesus. And then he asked Jesus, hey, will you remember me? And Jesus says to him, today you will be with me in paradise. He makes that statement. Today you will be with me in paradise. So I don't know, are we asking the question, if we're going to go through our list of 4 there, what does that statement seem to affirm, or does it affirm? Are we reading too much into it even to say it affirms any one of those views?
Way to start with one of the exception passages. Methodologically, it's often common to start with some of the baseline clear passages that are clear affirmations that we can work with. But let's go with the exception one. You threw that out there.
It's at the top of my list here. It's the first one that I came to. This is what happens if we don't plan well enough beforehand.
So,
Sam, you want to dig into this?
I can make some observations. Jesus says he says nothing about the soul. He says, you will be with me.
Right.
Not your soul will be with me. And in paradise, which is not the same thing as heaven. I mean, they're different words. We can talk about what that actually means.
Sure.
So that's a very simple sentence. Today, meaning after you die, which is going to be soon, you'll be with me in paradise.
Right.
So we can make some suggestions about which one that means, but it definitely doesn't seem to be a sleeping soul type situation, because if he's in paradise, will he not be conscious of the things? Mm-hmm. So it kind of it's hard to apply like the Daniel or the split grave to that.
Yeah, paradise is tricky because you don't have language of paradise a lot in the Old Testament. Although I believe in the Greek translation, paradise, especially in intertestament literature, is used to describe the garden, the Garden of Eden.
Yeah, because it's a Greek word.
And
although it's a loan word from, I think, Persian or something like that. if I remember right.
Spanish, I believe.
And in several intertestamental literature texts, paradise is used of, it's kind of like the garden that is on the earth, waiting. It's almost like concealed from human existence. You can take journeys, and angels can lead you there to see the garden and the tree of life. But it's kind of, we're blocked from it while we're living. But when the kingdom comes, then paradise will be revealed, and we'll be able to be back in the Garden of Eden. So that's one of the major uses of paradise language in the intertestamental period. It's a description of an earthly Garden of Eden that will be in the new heavens and new earth. But the word that trips me up when I try to locate views in light of this passage is the word today. Because there's one thing that's very clear in the New Testament, is that Jesus didn't die and go straight to heaven that day. As one of the tenets of faith is, up from the grave he arose on the third day. Which means, if today means within a 24-hour period of when I'm speaking to you on the cross, the one place we're sure paradise is not is in heaven. Because Jesus was in the grave that day.
And some confessions, like versions of the Apostles' Creed, even go so far as to say he descended into something like Hades or something like that, preached to the dead, and then came back from that. And so that's not biblical, but it's an interpretation of the Bible. But later traditions go so far as to affirm Jesus didn't go straight to heaven. Wherever he went, wherever this paradise is not heaven, but it's someplace else.
Yeah. You going to add, Ron, something?
Well, there are other passages I think that that kind of go along with it, but do they say the same thing? I'll back up a little bit. When we talk about the use of the word paradise, though, one thing that does come to my mind is this is coming from Luke's gospel. Most, at least conservative views of the authorship of Luke's gospel is that Luke is a Gentile. Now, I think that in all likelihood, if he truly was a Gentile Christian, the guy who traveled around with Paul at least part of his time, he betrays a high level of biblical literacy. I mean, Luke knows his Bible really, really well, and he expects his audience to have a high level of biblical literacy. Having said that, does that also include a high degree of literacy in non-biblical writings, intertestamental literature? That's kind of a thing that comes into my mind. If we're going to try to situate his use of the term paradise, of course, now I'm putting the word paradise into Luke's mouth and not Jesus's, and now people are going to stone me for that. I know, right? Or shoot me with the phasers from the Starship Enterprise.
I don't know why you're pointing at me. Let's just make
I
noises.
was hoping for some sound effects.
Yeah, some sound effects.
Is that my role, the sound effects guy?
Yeah, pretty much.
All right.
Let's get that in writing. So anyway, all that is to say, as I begin to think about how we situate the word paradise, it kind of raises some interesting questions that maybe we can't answer, but I do wonder just to the degree that it might be located within like the intertestamental period, or is it, because Luke is the one writing and is he using the term in a way that a more classic Greek speaker person from Greco-Roman culture would understand it?
Which would have been what?
Probably by about this time, is he using in the sense of, this going from a view of the afterlife as just Hades, which is roughly comparable to Sheol, to an emerging view that people who die well go to a place of bliss. The classic Greek view was just Hades, the underworld, and everybody goes to this really crappy place when they die. But now it's becoming, if you die as a good person, a righteous person, you might have this blessed place and this paradise used that way. I don't know that I can answer the question. I think I'm going to want to do a little bit more digging before I say definitively. It's the question that comes to my mind, though.
But in terms of our four, I see two options. Either, and it really has to do with how you understand the word today.
Yeah.
So either today is within a 24-hour period of Jesus saying that, which means Jesus is in the grave, which means paradise is someplace in the grave. And it is part of the intertestamental tradition, especially the Book of Enoch, where they believe that some people, when they die, went to a place in Sheol where if they were wicked, they're in a bad place in Sheol where it's not a pleasant place to be. There's a little bit of suffering going on. or they were a good person and they went to a better place of Sheol where there's like water flowing. It's kind of like a peaceful resting place. Mm-hmm. It's not like heaven or anything, but it's like the best way to rest in Sheol is by the waterfall. And then
I would say that
there's a third division of the grave in that view, which is the place where the martyrs go, where like they've been killed by someone who is still walking around with a smile on their face on earth, and they are there making their lawsuit, and complaining and crying out to God until justice is brought on earth and their killer is removed from life on earth. Then they can shift over to the happy place. So one option, if today is literal, I don't think Sheol can be in heaven. Because Jesus does not go to heaven until after his resurrection, after his ascension. Yeah. The Bible's pretty clear on that. Yeah. So it could be paradise is maybe a word for the happier place of the dead, where they wait for the resurrection on the new earth. That's one option. Another option could be something like soul sleep. Where the today is the today of the thief's experience. Like he's going to die. He's going to lose consciousness. He's going to the place of the dead. He's going to have a nothingness existence. His next real day, his next experience is he's going to be with Jesus in paradise, which could be the Garden of Eden, blissful place on the new earth, which is the most common way that language is used in the Second Temple period. That's another option. The today is not the literal 24-hour today, but the next day this guy's going to have, he's going to be with Jesus in a happy place. But it doesn't really say where that happy place is. So it could be the Garden of Eden unveiled on earth. It could be potentially a place in heaven or somewhere else. I mean, it's just not specified where that location is.
Yeah. So it doesn't seem to be the cartoon view, the spirit rising up like that, you're saying?
Yep.
Reunion view? Not exactly. I mean, he doesn't go into that.
There's no sense of a split.
Right.
Going different directions.
Right. Okay. So we're left with the last two. Daniel possibly.
Yeah.
But we'll say this passage just isn't clear. We just don't have enough to go on.
It is, and I agree with that. It is not very clear.
I'm glad we started with it, though.
Yeah.
Let's maybe go to one that's a little more clear, where maybe the teaching is a little definitive. That can be a baseline.
Well, if you're just, you're going to throw it out to me and try to lead me, and I don't know if I'm following you on this. But the thing of it is, the thing that sticks out to me in that passage, Jesus says, "You will be with me." Like, that's the thing that jumps out to me. You will be with me. Whatever paradise is, whatever today is, whatever we say about those things, the one thing that he says is, you're going to be with me. And that brings to mind at least two different passages in the New Testament that use very similar kind of language. And these are the next two on my list, which is why I'm going there. But in 2 Corinthians 5:8, Paul says, we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. And then Philippians 1:23, he says, my desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is better by far. It's far better. And so, a couple of other passages that have the same recurring theme, that whatever our experience is post-mortem, that we are with Jesus. And so I think that from that, people begin to make inferences. You have to figure out where Jesus is, and then from that, extrapolate, well, that's where we are.
And when post is.
Yeah.
There's two different versions of post-mortem.
Yeah.
There's immediately after you die, but before you raise from the dead.
Right.
And then there's after you die and after you raise from the dead. Both are post-mortem.
Yeah, exactly.
Both are things that happen after you leave life in this world as we know it.
Yeah. And to me, that raises another very interesting question that probably people are going to roll their eyes at. But in physics, time is related to space, time-space. If our souls are not physical in any measurable way, the way we understand physicality and space-time, if we step out of space-time, do we experience the passage of time the way we understand it right now? Like, is our post-mortem state really the blink of an eye and we're at the resurrection because we have slipped out of the way we conceive of time? This raises all sorts of questions that maybe have some bearing or maybe not, and we can't prove it, and Scripture doesn't speak to it. But at least it brings some data to the conversation that to me gives me a set of terminology with which to think about it. So time, today, now, all that.
Yeah. So the thing I heard clearly out of both of those references is after we die, we're going to be with Jesus.
Yeah. And affirming what Jesus says to the thief, the guy on the cross.
So home with the Lord is with Jesus somewhere.
Somewhen.
Somewhere, somewhen, yeah.
So the where is not specified.
Right.
It doesn't say we're going to be with Jesus in heaven. It doesn't going to say with Jesus in the new earth or with Jesus in Sheol. It doesn't say where. And it doesn't answer the when question with any kind of clarity, except to say after we die.
Yeah. But I think people come to this passage and they assume that when he says we'd rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord, that these are concurrent things. But they're not. That's not what he's saying necessarily. He's saying that is our goal, our hope. But there's this other thing, this reality that we live in now. And so I think that's where a lot of people get this die, go straight to heaven because, see, we can, be home with the Lord. That's what we're going home to be with Jesus. But that's not what he's saying. And I think that needs to be careful when in interpretation, when we're reading these things, to realize what's actually being said and what's not being said.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so these passages I've heard used to support the reunion view.
Sure, yeah.
Absent from the body. And then the assumption is that the post-mortem time is, and immediately after you die, you are with Jesus. Mm-hmm. And we know where Jesus is now. He's ascended, right, into heaven, at the right hand of the Father. So we get to be with Jesus at the right hand of the Father right after we die. And then because Scripture elsewhere talks about Jesus returning to this earth and inhabiting the new heavens and new earth, that implies then that the soul then descends with Jesus and then must, if you're to affirm some kind of resurrection, must somehow reunite with the body, the resurrected body, for the reunion of eternal life on earth, the new earth.
And I think people, when they go to in Paul's letters to the Thessalonians, he spends a lot of time dealing with some concerns that Jesus has already returned, the resurrection has already taken place, and the idea of those who remain here will not precede those who went beforehand. And now I didn't type that one out, so I don't have the exact wording here in front of me. So I want to be careful I don't butcher it. But I think there's that passage there that for some people at least would reinforce the reunion theory. So you guys are flipping through there. I'll just kind of kibitz until you find that passage there.
I'm sorry, you're going to do what?
Kibitz. You've never heard the word kibitz before?
I don't know.
I don't know if it's a Yiddish word or something like that. It sounds kind of Yiddish.
Stay in your lane, Ron.
Stay in my lane. All right, you got it. No Yiddish stuff.
In any event, you're slowing Sam down from finding the passage.
Yeah, I shouldn't talk to Sam while he's doing that.
Okay, so I'll read 1 Thessalonians 4.
Sounds right.
Beginning in verse 13. But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about those who have died, so that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have died. For this we declare to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will by no means precede those who have died. For the Lord himself, with a cry of command, with the archangel's call, and with the sound of God's trumpet, will descend from heaven. So Jesus is descending from heaven. Mm-hmm. And the dead in Christ will rise first. So those who are already dead are going to raise from the dead as Jesus comes down.
Implying that they have not been raised, resurrected, taken anywhere yet.
Right.
Okay. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up in the clouds together with them to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever.
Yeah, and so this passage, I think a lot of freight is placed on this in terms of what happens to people after they die, and this idea of Jesus bringing people with him when he returns. So now I'm opening up myself here, one page over.
But he doesn't bring them until he resurrects them.
I understand what you're saying, but I think that there's some inferences going on here. Is people, if they're going to appeal to a passage, that assumptions result in inferences in this passage here. So, sorry, I got to get there.
And let's be clear, the Greek is fallen asleep, so their souls sleep. Right, John?
Yeah, falling asleep is definitely a metaphor for death.
Right.
In the Bible.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Which does open up the view that they viewed the soul as sleeping.
So the line there in verse 14, God will bring with him those who have died. He will bring with them. The inference in that, I think, for many people, is that these souls are in heaven with God, with Jesus, and when Jesus returns, he's going to bring those souls with them. The bodies are going to rise from the grave, new bodies, not zombie bodies, but new bodies, and those dead souls will be reintegrated with those resurrection bodies. I think that's the inference. Now, I'm not making that argument. I'm saying I think that's the inference you often get when people read this particular passage.
Of course, 2 verses later, it does say, though, that he will descend, the dead in Christ will rise first. Like, the resurrection seems to happen then, not previously. Mm-hmm. So he's going to bring them with him, but it hasn't happened yet.
Right.
He's bringing, once he gets here, resurrects them, and then there's more bringing.
Yeah, so the question is whether the bringing is what happens when he shows up and blows the trumpet. It's almost like the big picture is given. Like, right. There's going to be a time, you don't have to worry about those who have died. God's got great plans for them. You don't have to worry about them. The ones who died are going to get their chance of glory too. It's not just the ones who are alive when Jesus comes. God's going to bring them with him too. Mm-hmm. So then let me tell you what's going to happen. The trumpet's going to sound, Jesus is coming down. Then he raises up the dead. Brings them with him. That's the fulfillment of the bringing with him. And then we too will join with them to meet Christ in the air. Now that can be confusing. Yeah. What does it mean that they're meeting him in the air? It's not so they can go there and then return to heaven. Right. And many New Testament scholars understand it to be this way, that we are kind of like the welcoming party going out to greet our King and welcome him to his kingdom. Yeah. Who has won victoriously, and we're welcoming him back to the city. It's kind of like the welcome parade. Claim your earth, your Lord, the lordship over all kingdoms of the earth. We're the ones rolling out the red carpet for Jesus when he comes back.
Yeah. Would you also say it's to allow him to recreate the earth?
It would buy a little time.
It's a long way up to the clouds.
Yeah, it would buy a little time for the renovation to happen. That has to happen on the earth, and we won't be there in the crossfire of things being fixed.
Sure.
Getting blown up, draining the swamp, all that.
2x4s hitting us in the face.
Right, exactly. One thing that I think has to be kept in mind is that in terms of the structure of 1 Thessalonians, what Paul is telling them is meant to give them reassurance. Paul's not actually saying this to give them detailed information about eschatological events and times events. What he's trying to do is say, whoever's telling you that the resurrection's happened or Jesus has already returned, don't listen to them. Okay, don't listen. You don't have to worry about that. And anybody who's making you upset about what maybe has happened to people who already died, you don't have to be upset. They're going to be fine. When Jesus returns, he's got it covered. He's got them taken care of. And so the whole purpose of this particular section of 1 Thessalonians is not to give detailed information about what happens after death, post-mortem state, or eschatological events. It's merely there to give you just enough information to go, oh, I feel better. I feel better about what's happened to my loved ones who have already died. And I don't have to worry about Jesus' return having happened already because it hasn't happened already.
Yeah. So there are some unclear things in that passage. Mm-hmm. What exactly is happening with meeting him in the air and why? Yep. Because nowhere else in the Bible do we have passages that talk about meeting in the air. This is really the only one.
This is the rapture passage.
Yeah.
This is where we get our word rapture.
So, if you have the view that you die, when you're raised, you go to heaven, then at least you could say, at the most you could say, is that you're dead in the ground until Jesus returns, and then you go to heaven. There's no basis to say you go to heaven from this verse right after you die.
Right, yeah.
That just defers going to heaven later on.
Yeah.
But this passage can just as easily be used for Jesus coming down for the earth, to renew the earth, restore this earth, bring his kingdom and fullness here. And this is kind of a welcoming party or getting out of the way of the shrapnel or something like that, where the postmortem state is here on the earth.
Yeah.
But it just doesn't go into detail about what happens after we meet him in the air. Yeah. What next?
Right.
You read that into this verse, what happens next, based on your other views.
Yeah.
So again, we have another unclear passage, Ron. We've introduced 3 unclear passages so far.
Well, and maybe that's the pattern we're going to see.
I'm breaking pattern. I'm introducing new verses.
You might be.
I'm going to go to...
Are they post-hole versions?
No, I'm going to go to the New Testament. Let's talk about the death of Lazarus.
Okay.
I think that's an interesting
Which one?
passage. The Lazarus who was a friend of Jesus.
Okay.
Yeah, the rich man and Lazarus.
Not the rich man and Lazarus.
No,
The other Lazarus, the friend of Jesus Lazarus.
Oh, you're John. I'm sorry. I thought you were
John's
talking about the rich
Lazarus.
man Lazarus. Okay. See, I guessed wrong.
no, you were going to another exceptional passage.
See, that's just the way I do it. That's
how
just
we
the way
roll.
I do it.
This is why this is an intervention. So this is an interesting passage because you have an account of someone who's a good guy, friend of Jesus, dying. And we have this conversation that Jesus has with Mary, which presupposes some of the views that they had about the afterlife. Mm-hmm. And this isn't one that's contested. There's no debate going on here. Lazarus is very ill, and she wants Jesus to come help. And eventually Jesus decides to join them. And so he starts talking in John 11:11. So after this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep," which is kind of interesting language.
Mine says his soul has fallen asleep. Is that no?
Does not.
Oh, okay.
But I am going there to awaken him. The disciples said, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but thought he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go." Okay. So then we have, when Martha heard, so this is Martha, I mistook it before I said Mary. In verse 20, when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask him." Jesus said, "Your brother will rise again." And here's the key verse, verse 4. So Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live." And so I think the key here is that she is spouting out Orthodox Jewish belief about the afterlife, which very much stands in line with the book of Daniel. Yep. I know on the last day he will rise from the dead. Jesus, what are you talking about? And of course, he's talking about something new that's going to happen, and there's a little digression about this. But I think that's the important passage, that she affirms the traditional Jewish belief that there is a resurrection on the last day. She was a follower of Jesus. She apparently received the teachings of Jesus, and this is what she came to believe. This, to me, is a baseline kind of passage. I do find, beyond that, I think we're going to run into speculation. Like, it is interesting that Jesus brings him back to life, and he doesn't say, "What in the world, Jesus? What are you doing? I was in heaven. I was with God. Why are you bringing me back?" Like, his resurrection would have been a downgrade.
Right.
If what you do right after you die is go to be with God in heaven, then resurrection for him would have been bad news.
Yeah, big time. In fact, I have heard anecdotally, and I don't know if I would need someone to verify this with evidence, but I've heard anecdotally about some missionary someplace was reading this passage and asking the people wherever he was to interpret, why did Jesus weep? And the interpretation from the people, wherever this missionary was they're weeping because he's going to bring Lazarus back. I mean, he's weeping because he's going to do exactly what you just described, John. He's going to yank him out of paradise or heaven or wherever he is, and bring him back to this world. And Jesus is really grieved that he's going to do this horrible thing to Lazarus. I mean, there was actually, evidently, again, anecdotally, some place where this was proposed as an explanation for Jesus' weeping. So at least somebody interpreted it that way.
Well, not just somebody. We don't need a mission field. We have America, where there have been books and movies written by people, 90 minutes in heaven or whatever the time frame is, where people supposedly die and they go to heaven and then they're resuscitated and they tell these tales of all these things. And so we have it even in our own culture about this view, and that's what people gravitate to. Like, the soul immediately goes into heaven, and then they were jerked back from being with God, and now we're back to earth, and that's not that's not what we want to be doing.
Yeah.
We should, like Paul, we want to be at home,
right,
as opposed to here in the body.
So maybe resuscitation is something we should resist the urge to perform. We're going to do this horrible thing to people.
If that's your view.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, if you're going to be dead until the resurrection, a little more time on earth doesn't hurt.
Right.
You might enjoy a little more the second time around.
Maybe appreciate it a little bit better.
It wouldn't be a downgrade.
Right.
It would be an upgrade from being dead. Which is the way it's presented every time someone is raised from the dead in Scripture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Whether it's Jairus' daughter, whether it's the resurrections going on in the Old Testament, it's always an upgrade when people are raised from the dead, which presupposes that where they were before was not in a better place.
Nobody complains when they come back. Nobody says,
No.
"Why did you do this to me? I was so much better off."
Yeah. I think
Samuel does.
Samuel, yes.
But that's a little different story.
When you're raised by a witch, it's
you
not
can have
good
all the
news.
objections you want. Okay.
I want to bring up another passage that's, I think, another kind of baseline passage. It's in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, after they tell about all the heroes of the faith, these great people who have gone before, like Abraham and Moses and Jeremiah and David and Gideon and Samson, all those who are listed. Chapter 11 ends in verse 39 by saying, "Yet all of these, though they were commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better, so that they would not, apart from us, be made perfect." I think that's another interesting kind of passage. Mm-hmm. The great heroes of the faith will not be made perfect without us, which sounds a lot like the Thessalonians passage, which almost was going the opposite direction. Don't worry about the dead. We're not going to be made perfect without them. Mm-hmm. And in this passage, he's going the opposite direction to say, listen, those who have died in their faith, they're kind of waiting on us to complete the race. And when we receive our reward, they will receive theirs. So the hope is future, not something that the heroes of the faith are receiving at death. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts or comments on that one?
It's definitely intriguing, and I feel like it's clear to us, but I've presented this to people and there's still pushback. Like, no, that's not what it means, or that's not what it's talking about, or that's not as clear as it should be. But I think all these passages, and that's why the confusing ones, they all can be shaped based on which of the four views you come at it with. They can be turned into sounding like that on some level. Mm-hmm. So, that's just an observation about passages in general.
No, I think there's a lot to that, what you're saying there, Sam, that I think people bring a lot of preconceived ideas to the question of what is the afterlife like? What do we experience after we die? And those assumptions inform the reading, which obviously happens all the time when people read the Bible. It's not just in questions of death, but all sorts of questions. People assume things as they read the Bible. Those assumptions inform their reading, and they draw out meaning that might not actually be there. In some instances, I would say definitely isn't there. And so I think in many of these passages, it's that baggage that people bring along with them. Baggage sounds kind of pejorative, but the preconceived ideas they bring to it inform how they read it, and assumptions are made, inferences are made, rather than letting the text speak for itself and not going beyond what is written, as Paul said.
Well, we've gone about 44 minutes And so I don't think we're going to get to the rest of the important passages today.
It's my fault. I went to the wrong ones first.
I think we're going to have to end this one on a cliffhanger, saying it is not clear yet what the New Testament says about afterlife.
Fair enough.
Especially in relation to the hope to die and go to a better place after we die.
Right.
So we're going to have to resume next time, which is going to be after our 2 episodes on the Restoration Movement, which are going to coincide with Restoration Appreciation Week.
Yeah.
So this cliffhanger is going to last a couple of weeks. So if you want to know how the New Testament comes together on the issue of whether we die and go to heaven, stay tuned.
Yep. Stick with us. We'll get there. We'll get there. So, as we always say, thank you very much for listening to the After Class podcast, because
the best conversations happen
after class.